Welcome, Dr. Al, to the Cayley Institute, where we are here today to talk about your book, The Starry Rubric, which you published just a decade ago. And I would like to say a little bit about you. You are first and foremost a mage, and you have a PhD from the University of Bristol, and you've published so much with so many different publishers, including founding your own series called Folk Necromancy in Transmission. So yes, let's, without further ado, take it away and talk about the genesis of Starry Rubric and explore some of its themes.
Thanks, Dr. Jen. It's great to be here. It's great to be supporting Cayley, and thanks for being here, everyone. Yeah, gosh, a decade, a little bit over a decade. It was 2012 it came out. Yeah. You remember when you were a kid and adults were like, "Oh, I haven't seen you in like 15 years," and you're like, 15 years is like several lifetimes. Like, how could someone not, like, and yet here we are. Hi.
Right.
So yeah, this book started and is primarily drawn from my master's by research research, if that's not a pleonasm. A master's by research is a Master of Arts, where you don't really do any of the like classes or hanging out with other people, and you just write a thing, like you do a thesis. I was chomping at the bit to start like a PhD and all these ideas about original research and things like that, but I wasn't ready for that. And so I did a Master of Arts by Research. The most time I ever spent with anyone else in my cohort also doing a Master's of Arts or a Master's by Research, other historians or anyone else, was actually graduation day.
Oh my gosh.
Which is probably as much my fault for just getting buried in the library. But I had a grand old time, and I wrote the Masters. It was fine. The Academy was like, yeah, that's okay. I was hoping for more in-depth kind of things. The Viva was very much classic academic Viva, but what do you think about a historiographical argument that happened 10 years ago, and being like, I just wanted to write about the stars and magic, really, but okay, let's talk about these historians arguing about a bunch of stuff as well. Oh, historiography. Anyway, I passed the research once it was finished on to a couple of friends, including my dear friend who actually passed this year, Jake Stratton Kent, who is the reason this book exists, basically. I passed it on to him as, hey, I know you're interested in astrology and magic and early modern cunning and those kinds of things. And he passed it on to one of his publishers, Hadean Press. And Urs and Dis contacted me and said, we've got this manuscript from you, and we'd like to publish it. And I say this not as any kind of humble brag, but I did not. It fell into my lap to be able to do this and this opportunity, and I really try and emphasize to myself that I was incredibly lucky to know some very generous and kind people who helped make this happen. It really does like take a village a lot of the time. And while I published like little bits and pieces here and there, this was the first like book with my name on it that I put out. And the Hadeans were and continue to be amazing. I got to throw my 2 cents in helping design like the cover and things like that. It also means that when people ask me like, how do you get started in publishing? I have no idea. I other than like have cool friends that want to share your work and support you. And so I try and pay that forward in terms of working with a number of publishers now, including yourself, Dr. Jen, in terms of sourcing, talking to people, helping give feedback on things if they ask for it, and passing on good work to say like, hey, this is good and more people should see this, to try and like pay back and pay forward the great kindnesses that were done for and to me. So that's kind of the superhero origin story of the book itself. Yeah.
Superhero origin story. So just to go back to the start, that kind of master's program is unique to the UK, or the UK kind of system, yeah?
I think so, yeah. From what I gather, a lot of US universities are a lot more interested in turning out actually trained teachers. And so most of the master programs actually involve like having some time to either get to or have to teach a bunch of other people, TAing and so on and so forth, or even designing curriculums in some cases. While that is possible to do in many UK universities, unless you kind of fight often tooth and nail for it, you just have to turn up and write the damn thing and pass the exam. There's not a lot of emphasis necessarily placed, unless you want to really lean into it on professional development or the skills to actually utilize any of this research and make it available.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I was also doing an awful lot of performance poetry, both in terms of like cabarets and comparing cabarets, and also going around schools and teaching kids performance poetry and oratory and public speaking skills and things like that. So I kind of accidentally had a bunch of transferable skills to be able to talk about any of this. But yes, on the whole, the UK is like UK universities are very much more like, but what is the work? Like, have you turned up to classes? Have you turned in your papers? As opposed to like, do you know how to communicate this to anyone, or how to fill out a grant application, or any of the other things that you kind of need to do if you're going to pursue that kind of career path.
Right, right. And so how did you land on astrology as the topic for your study, given that you have such a deep background in magical practice?
Well, like any angry teenager, late teenager, I went to university attempting to, train in the vital historical skills to be able to forward the revolution. I was very angry Marxist teenager. I've mellowed now. I'm a lot more into anarcho-syndicalism. So I wanted to study history, and I wanted to study the English Revolution. I wanted to see how we could do this again, basically. What went wrong? What can we learn from it? How can we do it again? I wasn't there, I promise. I'm a normal amount of years old human being.
We now learn that you're actually 400 or 500 years old, but it's okay.
the whole Alexander Cummins in the Isabel Gowdy records, the Dyer of Black Cloth, he has a G on his name, so that can't be me. And I will stand by that. I was never there. Gosh, where are we going with this?
So the angry Marxism led to astrology. I think Nick Campion has that in his lineage with The Great Year that came out in the late 90s, because it was pre-millennial tension, like
exactly. Yeah, looking at historicism, looking at the ways in which we try and understand the mechanics of history, undoing a positivism that has this idea that history is inevitably getting better, and we can grade civilizations by how close they are to white European 19th century standards, a terribly kind of Eurocentric kind of business. So undoing that and looking to see the kind of sine wave of history of remembering and forgetting things, and the way we think about, very much, Nick's ideas around like explaining deep time and Karl Popper and things like that. And so from wanting to look at the revolution, realizing that not only magic played a huge part, which I, understood, at least at some sense on a personal level, having already, got a practice of divining and talking to ghosts and things like that. But realizing that this was embroidered into the political and social fabric of the revolution and of people's lives. And I've always had an emphasis, like a lot of lefty leaning historians, on like social history and like grassroots, what were people doing, especially the kind of people that didn't necessarily get ready access to writing down, or the time or skills to be able to write down what everyday life was like. And so from there, realizing that sure, I could dive into the grimoires I was already reading and interested in, but I wanted to get a wider sense of what was it like, not just for the equivalent of magic weirdos like me, but for everyday people engaging in an organically, naturally magical cosmos. And so that was really the focus, and also realizing that like I was a lot more interested in environmental and kind of ecological concerns off the back of thinking about, again, natural magic and the kind of unfolding of nature naturally and magically, attempting to disassemble this sense that magic is what happens in the abnormal and the freakish and the supernatural and that which we can't explain, at least yet, as opposed to just what the cosmos is just doing as naturally, organically, magical, alive, responsive, and I would argue kind of animist.
Yeah. So can you take us, I think the beginning of your text, do we really have to understand the mindset or the sort of, ambient worldview in the drinking water at the time? So can you narrate for us what that must have been like to be an early modern individual at the time whose astrology was infused in their life world?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, you see this. The three main themes of the book are about like environment, how we understand, I don't just mean like when crops grow, although like absolutely that is a crucial part of understanding, how people were engaging with not just star law, but like the impact of the stars in their lives. So we're absolutely talking almanacs here, and I will certainly stand Bernard Capps' Astrology in the Popular Presses. It's like the 70s, and it's still like a phenomenal work that's really worth engaging with. This was telling people when to plant things according to moon phase, as well as sun sign, and even some like pretty complicated like electional stuff, as well as when to geld their lambs, when to harvest wood. But that also extended into like when to cut your hair, when to ask a hottie if they wanted to go to the dance with you, like that kind of thing as well. So these social kind of decisions and these interpersonal decisions were also being informed by this kind of stuff. Also, we got like high cosmic scales of like time itself. All sorts of astrologers and occult philosophers love to quote Proclus in terms of saying that time is the motion of the celestial bodies. And so like here we have this idea of thinking about the unfolding of time itself as like whether the sun is going around the earth or vice versa, whether we're talking about like the controversies of a geocentric versus a heliocentric model, of this idea that we're mapping time, which also means we're talking about periodization, and we're talking about periods of time in both human time and also like deep time, of how we understand epochs and eras as well. And this starts to inform an awful lot of kind of vaguely sort of biopolitics of like, well, if a period of time has, if there's a period where heaven operates on human bodies in a particular way, as royalist astrologer George Wharton is really into, there's going to be periods where people are all affected by something equally. There's going to be periods where we're better at looking after ourselves, and there's going to be periods where we're very bad at doing it. And this informs politics. Like how do we manage resources and people, bearing in mind that we're all under these different influences. And this periodization leads to all sorts of ideas about the manner and conditions of princes that you'll see in early modern texts. But they're also talking about everyday people and how we understood this coming week, as well as like the last 10 years, the last 100 years. And this kind of thing is super important once we do actually get to the English Revolution, where we kill a king for betraying his own people, which is kind of a new deal at the time. Previously, treason is how can the king be treasonous against himself, right? But separating king from kingdom becomes very important, as does and so we have this idea that we get all the political propaganda then of the stars are on our side, and so people are engaging with that sense of like, where do I put my allegiances when household is divided against household between royalists and parliamentarians during this whole period. It's even worse in Scotland, where you've got Charles escaping so frequently and raising armies to then add to and fight the English and each other. It becomes a very, very difficult affair, a tumultuous affair, full of, especially when we get to what gets called the period of the Second English Civil War. Historians say there are roughly 3 periods of like war, depending on who you ask. Second one is especially bloody because the honor-bound system of the time means that like a bunch of people after the first set of conflicts are like, we promise never to do it again, and if we do, then you can behead us all. And so a bunch of people, once war starts up again, are like, well, you promised, so head on the pikes, please. So it's a really violent time. There's also an awful lot of plague, all sorts of other like famines and things like that. They're also, a staple of pre-modern existence. And so this is also very much a life and death thing of like, I need some guidance on what the stars and God say I should be doing. And so this informs not just like how I'm going to vote or like, the kinds of things I'm going to complain about, but also like how people live their damn lives. The other aspect of that living of life is that it vastly informs medicine. Astrology is the most popular form of medical diagnosis of any sort, just ahead of like uroscopy, like studying a patient's urine, as well as a variety of other forms of divination. But astrology really is the one that people go to because it embroiders and coheres a whorling set of influences, right, of different proclivities, energies, and sympathies, right, and antipathies, obviously, of course, and so helps people understand contexts. People don't just have charts, places have charts, events have charts, interactions have charts, and so this charting, this navigating of these incredibly choppy waters over the 17th century in England particularly, but in early modern Europe in a wider sense, really helps people do anything from understanding the weather and their climate. And again, climate used to mean not just the weather, but everything under the weather. So, natural history, like biology, all that kind of stuff, as well as what was going on in terms of like which soldiers were going to turn up and try and either kill you or take you on their way to go and fight for something and presumably die in some field. And indeed, like what to do if you got ill or fell in love or did any of the things that, we hope to do and we hope not to do in a human life.
Yeah.
So hopefully that gives a little bit of context to that kind of thing.
Yeah. There's some, when you go back to the periodicity, there's a moment that stands out reading it now that I don't think I would have picked up on when it first came out and when we first met. I met you, I think, just around the time this was being published. So, and it was funny because one of the first things you ever said to me, I had a little kind of soda and there was a unicorn on it. And I was remarking with Rod Suskin about it. And you go, and like, you were just overhearing us and you passed by and you said, in accordance with the prophecy. And I was like, this guy, I have to know this guy. So reading your work again today, and you're talking about this periodicity, you mentioned the cycles of Saturn and Jupiter conjoining in intervals that produce a sort of micro pattern of 20 years and a macro pattern of around 800. And then in between of those things, there's this 200-year shift that lets you eventually achieve that almost 800. I think it's 759 or something like that. Anyway,
like that,
yeah. So, but what you also then suggest, and this is bracketed in between something that I'd love to spend more time talking about after this comment and insight and asking you what you think about this. Black Monday in 1652 falls exactly in between the 1640 to 1660 press freedom, that in the freedom of press is unleashed. People are no longer being censored. So you have all of these publications erupting out of nowhere and propaganda just flourishes. And in the middle of this, there is not only the conjunction of Saturn with Jupiter, but Mars and Saturn conjoin as well. And if you recall back in 2020, we had a conjunction of Mars and Jupiter, or sorry, of Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius with Mars conjoining Saturn in Capricorn when it went retrograde. So we have this confluence, and you were saying, oh yes, and they say if Jupiter conjoins Saturn, there'll be a plague. And if Mars conjoin Saturn around that same time, it'll be bad. And I'm going like, oh my gosh, little did you know, 10 years from getting this published, we have this, experience of plague unleashed around the world as well, and so to read this and then you're just like, and that was called Black Monday. And I'm like, well, what are we going to eventually call what we all just lived through in the last 3 years, and for many of us is still ongoing as a permanent threat. So but the thing that I'm noticing there isn't just the periodicity of the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions and that trigon shift, which historians of science love to pick up on. And when they talk about the history of astrology, they're like the English Civil War and the trigon shift story, right? Because that becomes the sort of, it's in one element and then another, and then another, and then it's finally permanently switched and we have democracy in the UK, right? Or some kind of like representative parliamentary situation. That's not just monarchy, right? Anyway, my point being, though, is just that what is the relationship? This is the complicated question for you. What is the relationship between the lack of censorship, or the lifting of the censorship for this 20 years, and then the confluence of this disease happening at the same time? And the sort of like is there anything there, like a kind of?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. In terms of like how people are thinking about like disease and time and the whole period between 1640 and 1660 is you get this lifting of the printing press restrictions, where most of the time in theory you had to take the book to a member of the king's court. In practice, that was far broader, and it had different rules if you were any kind of divine or involved in like ecclesiastical courts or authorities like that. So it's not quite the case that you literally had to like track down a nobleman and be like, read and say my book is okay to publish, but some form of like, if not censorship, then some very heavy restrictions on what people would be allowed to publish. Off the back of standard publishers, obviously there were small printing presses that like were publishing an awful lot of like Catholic stuff during a very anti-Catholic period. So by 1640, for a variety of like breakdowns of reasoning and like trust and all sorts of other things, these printing press restrictions are almost entirely lifted. And so you get this period where there really isn't any regulation going on. And one of the things that happens is you get a kind of second wave of what many historians of magic refer to as the democratization of magic, where suddenly people are able to not only circulate manuscripts without necessarily getting in as much trouble, but actually like print them as well. This is the period where Robert Turner, for instance, alchemist and botanist, is translating a bunch of Paracelsus and putting that out. That's less, problematical. But you also get in, the fourth book of occult philosophy being printed in English at this time, which is full of literally like, oh, you want to do necromancy? Here's how you do it. And while the laws on magic itself are a bit variable over the 1500s and 1600s, you get all sorts of witchcraft acts coming in at various points saying you still can't do magic. The idea of writing about it and owning books about it becomes a lot more, if not acceptable, just easier to do. I sometimes liken it to, I don't know if this is comparable in the US, but apparently there was a period in the, like, video nasties partly exist, like old, like real, like slasher 80s, like bad, like not even B, like K movie, like horror, partly exists because the UK, I think, had a guy who still owns a VHS store at a festival was telling me once that, like, when it started, the UK didn't really have the same rules about censorship for straight to home movie videotapes, because it was a kind of relatively new medium at the time, and so the censors hadn't caught up yet, and so they were able to put out all of this like weird, sometimes experimental, but mostly just gross kind of stuff. And I think there's something in a kind of, I don't want to be too much of a cool historian and be like, grimoires were the iPads of their day, but like there's something of a comparison in there. And so you've got all of this new magic going on. You've got this absolute explosion in almanacs. Suddenly everyone wants to own, and all sorts of things about how the English don't just learn their astrology from almanacs, but learn to read from almanacs. All sorts of French authors over and are horrified. That people are reading more almanacs than the Bible, and things like this. And so this sense of folding the stars into our actual life and finding and unfolding them from our lives is a huge deal. And so so many more people have a lot more grasp of like what's to come. And so arguably, a little knowledge is also sometimes a dangerous thing. And there've been many people arguing that, like, with more people worrying and speculating on what Black Monday would be, this produces a lot more of the scare.
Well, I'm wondering also about how much fake astrology was being published, because around the Reformation inside Germany, there were deliberate forms of astrological propaganda, fake astrology being designed in order to be a political tool to influence people's behavior. So did you find that happening also around the Black Monday prophecies?
A fair bit. I mean, most folks are, saying this is probably going to be bad, and it's probably, there's a mass exodus from the city. That's one of the main things. Again, imagine that. Not anything we can have any life experience comparison to now, unfortunately, over the last 3 years. But this fleeing also produces a bunch of like economic like shortages, which are, said to be in part, an aspect of the sometimes said to be part of the Jupiterian aspect of like plenty and the breakdown of not just infrastructure, but like economic growth, if we want to put it like that. Again, this idea that the holistic model that an astrological approach to the cosmos gives you means, of course, like one thing is going to cause something else that you might not expect. Plague and people's reaction to plague is going to have an economic impact. In theory, it has a political impact where people start arguing a lot more. One of the things you do find in the case of the Black Monday and a bunch of those other specific events is that you see less fake astrology in terms of, no, that's a wrong chart, right? We don't see so much because that itself is a flex, right? Your charts are off. You don't know what you're talking about. That's information we can all agree on. What you do see is like vast disagreements between what it means. So the interpretations like are vituperatively different. The shade of it all that is cast, right? Like not just like you're a dumb, like William Lilly, one of the most famous astrologers of the 17th century, is criticized by his opponents as like he doesn't even set his own charts, right? He's you know,
Mm.
again, an argument none of us have any experience of, right? In the modern world, trying to do whatever forms of astrology we are, right? Oh, he doesn't even set his own charts. You can't listen to him. Along with, and I think Black Monday is a good example of like these arguments over the horary art of something, which also bleed over into natal stuff as well. The arguments over Charles I's nativity, for instance. No one really argues what his birthday or his birth time are. We kind of all agree on that. But again, you know, no shade to any Leo placement people around, but you know, John Gadbury as a royalist can talk about how his Leo temperature, his temperament makes him, you know, an excellent sanguine choleric. It makes him a natural leader. He's prince-like, he's magnanimous, he's imperious, right? Whereas Lily is eventually siding with Parliament, just says like this makes him obstinate, right? So again, we're not so much arguing that he is or isn't a Leo, we're arguing about what that means.
Right.
And again, no shade to any Leos here. Thank you for joining us.
Early modern shade. So yeah, that's fascinating, because I think also there's this relationship that you draw out, you know, and going back to your own angry teenage Marxist roots, the propaganda piece, the lack of censorship and the freedom of press that gets a 20-year break, for example, like to me, those are material conditions that are so important that you've drawn out to focus on and show people, you know, the proliferation of astrology changed during that time, not just magic, but also the astrology. And also you show very expertly, and I'd love to hear you say more about this, about the relationship of like astrology as being always already magical, but magic needing to recognize that it might be always already astrological as well. But I just wanted to note for everyone, you know, the way that Dr. Alexander Cummins talks about these material conditions is so important, because I'm sitting in a room of books. Publishing is the way ideas spread immortality, right? So this publishing freedom, and it gives gravity, authority to whatever's being said, regardless of, you know, the disagreements inside interpretations. The fact that it could be in ink is a big, big deal. And so I'm really happy that you've been able to draw that out in your work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing. It's not just amazing handbooks of astrology like Lily's Christian Astrology, or you know, even like mathematicians like Henry Coley publishing The Key to the Whole Art of Astrology, or like Middleton doing some like John Middleton doing some like you know, kind of truncated, okay, you haven't got time to read 800 pages, here's it in like a couple hundred, like practical astrology. It's also, and not just even in almanacs as well, of like when to plant my things, but also like medicine, right? Like physics is also inherently astrological a lot of the time. You even get like I mentioned in the book like John Lampert's treatise on smallpox, where he publishes a second edition because he has this either change of heart, or like he says in the foreword to the second edition, I just forgot. I didn't realize how important astrology was, not just to talk about the conditions like plague when disease is more rampant, or there's a wave of like you need to be careful about epidemic, but also like treatment, like what kinds of treatment, like astrologically, what kinds of diagnosis to pre and proscribe those treatments, but also like timing of when to take the medicine, like what time of day, what time of week, what time of year, all those things also play part. And he's like, this treatise doesn't have anything to do with astrology explicitly, but I have to include it in here. As well as, of course, like these wider, you know, more scholarly works on occult philosophy and natural magic, like, you know, Giambattista della Porta's Natural Magic is translated into English at this period. Of course, Uncle Heinrich's 3 books and the 4th book of some of his B-sides and a bunch of other things. You spend enough time, grumpy Uncle Heinrich, as well as like these like categorical books of like, oh, you want to know like spells, like like ritual stuff, and I will absolutely bang on for you know, I'll enthuse hard about Reginald Scott's discovery of witchcraft, which is called like the first print English language grimoire, which again is one of the spearheads of the democratization of magic, that includes, you know, that shows how astrology sits alongside the absolutely, you know, cunning and magic of like how to summon angels and demons and the dead and fairies and these kinds of things. And sure, you find astrology there, but kind of to return to your point around, that astrology doesn't just find itself rubbing up against like magic or is a useful tool for magicians. I would argue it's also pretty explicitly magic, which kind of requires that we understand at least what early moderns understood by magic. And the way I kind of approached that was to think about the principles by which it was said to work, and to think about those principles as organizational and operational. And so the organizational principles we're probably pretty familiar with, like the building blocks of like what is nature made of and how does it interact with each other. These are like the 4 elements, right? Or the 7 planets or the 12 signs, as well as schema that help us organize their movement and change, like the 12 houses or the various schemas for the mansions of the moon. Those organizational principles, like those building blocks, like are kind of key to at least like Western astrologies and many of the other forms, right?
Well, and on that note, you do a great job of distinguishing between what's astronomical observation and what is symbolic division due to these cosmologies, which is not the same thing.
Right. There's plenty of people doing so. And again, I'm far more of a keen geomancer than I am, like, strictly speaking, an astrologer. I want to be clear on that. Like, I'm comfortable talking about the history of astrology, but like that's one of the many reasons I love working and being friends with you, Jen, is being able to be like, is this? And you're like, well, and you can like lay out a bunch of stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's what so and so was going on about when I read that thing 300 years ago. Like when I read that book that was written 300 years ago. Yeah, exactly. Like looking at where and geomancy is absolutely about like how can we use the as the sister of astrology, how can we use the use and rules and language of the stars without ever looking through a telescope or flipping through an ephemerides, right? These are and geomancy, which is also practiced during this time and kind of kicks off far more broadly, at least in English, is also, arguing about space rather than just time, and is talking about the infusion of the seeds of the stars contained in the gems of the in the sublunary earth, to kind of misquote the prayer of the gnomes, right? That like these planetary influences have already invested and imbued the sublunary world where we live, where all our stuff is, the material conditions, and so the job of the geomancer and certainly the conjurer is to, if nothing else, remind a bunch of nature that it's already magical. Here's the root of ritual itself, right? When Agrippa says, why do we need to do ritual if everything is naturally full, if a sunflower is full of solar virtue? Well, we need to wake it up and remind it of those things. It is dormant. And so the idea of putting 6 sunflowers on a golden altar cloth with 6 yellow candles in an hour of the sun on a Sunday is about being like, hey, remember you do all this stuff, remember how cool you are. And I like that as a grassroots movement of reminding nature how powerful it is, so that it might remind us our agency and responsibility. And I think that's something that astrology should do, because it is engaging in this magic. I have far more sympathies for astrologers who are like, oh yeah, we're totally operating in a magical universe. Like we are, whether we're animists or strict.
But there's so many modern astrologers who would define themselves as exoteric astrologers who don't see this connection. And so there's one thing you say to push back against the more exoteric practitioners. You have this beautiful formulation that almost like bopped me over the head. I was like, oh, of course Al's going to say it the most elegant way possible. But you said electional astrology is enchantment.
Yeah.
And it was go into that a little bit, because to me, when you formulate it that succinctly and so elegantly, I'm like going, of course it is, but oh my God, like how did that come to you? How did you get to that idea to formulate it that way?
It was looking at what people did with that, not just when they elected. And again, like you find elections not just for famously our man John Dee, Dr. D, electing the coronation of Liz Wan, based off what's the best time and what's gonna give you the longest reign. I think we can chalk that up to a win, regardless of what you think of what Elizabeth Wan got up to. So we've got elections for that kind of thing, for big political events, right? Like when the Queen is going to be crowned. You've also got it for like Samuel Jeeks electing in his diary, in the back of it, in code, no less, arguing in his own diary in like long form. I love to look at natural astrology, but I would never elect. That's far too magical. So for a start, these people thought it was magical. But then also when push came to shove, and when the really important things, like when is he going to try and propose to his sweetie Elizabeth Hartshorn, like he's electing them, right? So these elections are happening. The people doing them are sometimes even embarrassed at how magical it is, because they're also aware enough to know, like, I know this is magic, but I also know I shouldn't, other people aren't going to like it, right? Again, not so dissimilar to this day necessarily. But it's what they were doing with the charts afterwards that fascinates me most. And Jeek is also electing, as a merchant, he's also electing when to build things like grain silos. And once he has got the election, once he's charted from this walling set of influences, a particular moment that is best disposed to it, that becomes a kind of save point in time. And if that was the moment that this is not just about predicting this moment looks like this is going to be best for something, but actually a chart is an image of those conditions. And if we think about this in terms of a chart as image magic, it makes total sense that people would, for instance, carve electional charts into things that they had built at that time in order to talismanically gather, cohere, and radiate that save point of those particular sets of influences. Many early modern occultists and historians of magic have likened the making of talismans. I'm sure your audience is at least some of your audience is familiar with this, with making jam, right? The idea that like the stars fruit at a particular time and the fruit of the stars falls, and sure, like if you catch it on the right day, it's apple's day, and you can catch the apple as it falls rather than bonking you on the head and accidentally discovering gravity like it didn't exist before. But also, if you want apples like in 3 months, instead of like, poking a tree for all of its rotten fruit, you can preserve them in some way in the sterile container and sugars of a jar. And that this is what a talisman is. Like this is what people are doing with elections. Like categorically, they are using these things to not only predict and make decisions, but also to influence the things that they are deciding about in their favor.
I mean,
so
that type of just boots on the ground daily activity. I mean, if you have a homestead and you don't have electricity or refrigeration or an ice chest or anything of that stuff, you have to act in the world of saying, okay, it's peach day, it's apple day, it's fig day, and that's what it is. And if you don't do it now in this week, that's it. And so these methods of preservation are second nature. I mean, even as in my lived experience, I was living in East Germany in 1998, so about 8 years after the wall fell, and my host mom was preserving everything because she spent her entire lifetime having to, even though they had, the ability to buy things in stores that they didn't have access to in East German government system. And so, when you say that in this format now, it's like, well, there's not a big leap going from I'm needing to make the best apple jam in town to I'm going to make the best astrological talisman to harness the energies here and then be able to use them and apply them as if I could have a bite of this beautiful jam in 5 months from now when it's the middle of winter,
right, when I really need it, when like I'm and again, food ways are absolutely a crucial part of understanding the astrological impact, understanding, and influence that's contained in understanding nutrition in this period, which is all humoral theory, not just a 4-part BuzzFeed test of are you more of a Samantha or a Miranda, right? But like starting but it's that too, right? Yeah. That's humoral theory, right? Again, the king is a sanguine choleric. This explains, he's such a Samantha, right? It also informs like what you eat, right? And you're eating nature, like that's where you didn't grab it from outside of the cosmos. And so when you are cold in winter and you are melancholy, you are overly dry and cold, like you are earthy, then you need some of that spring. You need some of that like fire and heat and wetness of the springs in the summer to come in and be able to like rejuvenate your soul as well as your body, right? Like spiritual fulfillment and nurturing also came from what you eat. Like again, the astrology underlying humoral theory is again elements, planets, signs, houses, mansions, etc. Right? Like understood through these principles of how we utilize reflection, or how we utilize any of those like operational principles of similitude or signature or what have you. So diet, it becomes this huge part. So that's the jam thing isn't even just a metaphor, right? Isn't just an analogy. It's also literally and understood.
But I'm thinking about the early modern context of that life wave dependent upon that. Like they didn't know anything else because that's what they had to do in order to survive the intensities of the environment at that time, because the Industrial Revolution hadn't given everybody fire in a wire to have permanent access to light and heat at all times, or refrigeration even. So in a life world where that becomes a normal thing of like, oh, everybody, look, the apple trees are going off. We got to do this now. And they come together and rally, that to me is just, I'd never really seen that, like, or actually like, because we're talking about it, it feels easier to understand. Like, of course, going from that to making talismans is not a far cry. It's like a tiny step and not a massive leap, right?
Yeah, and you see this with a bunch of the publications of things called the Shepherd's Almanac or the Shepherd's Calendar. This is a whole kind of genre in of itself that, yes, is very much like an almanac, but it also has a lot more charms in it. And some of those charms, a lot of those charms that there's a favorite of mine, which is a Jupiter talisman, where you're electing based off the hour, like big folk astrology grimoire kind of cunning of like day and hour of Jupiter, but it's folded into a bunch of, it's not just stripped down, we won't bother doing a complicated election for this. It involves a bunch of like writing different weird numbers on a piece of paper. There's a petition paper, you write a bunch of weird numbers, there's some numerology going on. You soak you bundle it in a piece of cloth. That cloth is meant to be soaked in a particular plant juice, like vervain, I think it is. It's meant to have some herbs in with it as well. Like the things that folk magicians have done for a very long time, bundling things with herbs and roots by particular times and writing particular little prayers and stuff like that in things, is also part of this like folk movement of like, there's a good time to do this. Like we should strike while the iron's hot. Like we should take best advantage, because just because the world is full of spirits also means the night is full of horrors, and also like life is hard, right? And times of war, as Hobbes says, nasty, shortish, and brutish and short. And so, yeah, absolutely, these become not just escapisms or intellectual theorizations, but like a necessary part of living and making decisions in life. Yeah, so awesome. Just, in terms of the front part of the book definitely reads like the sort of lit review that an MA thesis needs to have, but you sort of sort out, Patrick Curry is over here, saying there's this kind of high astrology and low astrology, and yet you're kind of saying like, it's not even about that distinction between these two things. It was immersed in literally everything, without like even in the middle strata that maybe Curry's not aware of or needing to categorize or call out in his work, Prophecy and Power, which is actually going to be coming back into print soon, by the way. Awesome.
Yeah. So
speaking of Marxist,
yeah, exactly right. And so will The Great Year, by the way, on that note, because I'm like, I got to get all my favorite history of astrology books back into print and also talking about them. So thanks everybody for coming to talk about the Starry Rubric. I'd love to pivot now. I feel like I've definitely exhausted my questions for the moment. I want to leave time for others to chime in. Does anyone in our lovely audience have a question for Dr. Al? Feel free to unmute yourself and turn your video on and ask away. Don't be shy. Anyone? Bueller, Ferris? While someone's getting the confidence to issue a question, I'd love to ask if your vantage point now from 10 years after initial publication and also doing the work, is there anything that you would add or subtract or kind of alter if you were to create a second edition of this text?
Yeah, absolutely. Along with I have realized in my career so far in publishing and in working with publishers that the surest fire way to find a typo for sure is to publish the book and then open it to any random page where you will discover any number of means to beat yourself up about slightly weeing in the pool of inaccurate information, right? Now in the world. So there were a couple of typos.
Yeah. Well, that's not what I mean. I mean more substantial kind of additions and subtractions. Everybody has a typo. That's like,
Exactly.
And Liz Green even said, when I was working with Liz Green on her PhD thesis turned into a book called Magi and Magadim, we were trying to eradicate all errors, and we kept going through the file again and again. And she would go, I think they proliferate in the night. Like, we'll have something set, think it's perfect. And she just goes, the errors proliferate in the night. And it's never left my head. Like, this also, she said this to me in 2012. So I'm just kind of like, every book kind of secretly just like conspires against you to just like mess with you, and like a few footnotes get out of order or something. It's just like, that's how you know you're just in it.
Yeah, the ape of Thoth or the printer's devil. Yeah, so there's that stuff, right? And so they're like technical things of like I want to put an index in and things like that to make it easier for people. But like overall, like in terms of like what to actually like change or add or whatever, I've spent the last 11 years really concentrating far more on cunning craft. And understanding the folk astrologies, and especially the geomancy. I mean, there's a fair amount of geomancy in there, at least as a reference point. But I would definitely want to talk more about, it does talk about cunning detection, for instance, using various folk astrologies for finding lost property or missing people or thieves, as well as like compelling them to return that property and things like that, or finding treasure as well. But I think it gives a great insight into again the fact that astrology and magic, we're not so different, you and I, right? It's my favorite supervillain speech. In another lifetime we could have been brothers. I think they're already brothers or sisters, or siblings,
identical twins, actually, dare say, fraternal at least.
Yeah. Right. And for that matter, I definitely thought more, having written this book, about science as the offspring of magic, who is terribly embarrassed by his actually awesome mom, right? But wants to be like, no, mom, it's not like that. I'm gonna do my own thing, right? Science still feels like a kind of petulant teenager sometimes, especially the like, the more like new scientoid, new atheist kind of petulant, like, theology isn't real because God isn't real stuff. Like, anyway, off my soapbox. I would want
Watch
to talk
this
more
plant
about
take away my wart when I go through it at this planetary hour. Hold the nitrogen.
I would want to talk more about folk practices, more about people's engagement with magic that wasn't just abnormal, that wasn't just, don't get me wrong, unbewitching is one of, cunning folk bread and butter, and something I do in my own professional practice a lot. When you need someone to help you like lift some adverse spiritual conditions, like those folks did a lot of that, but it wasn't. But again, reading a recent text by Tabitha Cadbury or Stanmore, on cunning folk from or service magicians from like the late medieval, even through to the early modern, pointing out that like the concentration on looking at folk magic only when like something like witchcraft happened, when the really abnormal or horrible things happened, belies the fact that most people's engagement with this stuff was actually more about like, setting a date for the wedding, or like,
so you want to talk about boring things, borecraft.
I want to talk
the average. I want to
talk about, like, to quote the Fifth Doctor, right? The tiny moments of joy that make life worth living. Yeah,
not the states of exception or the extremes or the emergencies. You want to talk about this quotidian, average, daily scenario, mundane in a
and hopefully show that they're not so different. And hopefully show they're not so that like in not just in infinity and a grain of sand, not just like I can find anything and anything as an intellectual exercise, but like, again, the doctorate I ended up going on from this was about magical approaches to the passions. It was reading these astrological and geomantic charts of clients talking about the affairs of their hearts that really moved me, and that made me feel connected to the people that came before us in a way that I hadn't before, and that's something I'd very much like to keep exploring and
transmitting.
That
to
I think
us
a lot of babies. Yeah, I think a lot of babies were thrown out in the Enlightenment bathwater of ways of holistically understanding how our hearts play a huge role in our health, in our decisions, and our ways of being in the world and with each other.
We have a few questions coming in. Dustin's asking, where can this book fold into the geomancy courses you offer? And is there a class where it works in tandem best with?
Yeah, so this is very much a, it's a history book. It's about giving you a context for like what these people are doing. It absolutely gives you a bunch of the names. In terms of like the classes I offer on geomancy, sure, you could read this and be like, oh, I'm interested in this this Richard Napier character. Like he's a cool, like he's an astrologer physician. He's an angel summoner. He regularly brings in the archangel Raphael, the healer of God, as like a referral or like a second opinion on a lot of his client cases. He has a specialization in what we would now call like mental health impairments of like cognitive and emotional and spiritual faculties. And a lot of the things he's doing is around how to distinguish whether a patient is cursed, pixie-led, demonically possessed or obsessed, physically ill, or otherwise like emotionally disturbed, or any combination of those things. And again, astrology and geomancy were used heavily to do that. I have a course called An Angel, a Devil, and the Dead, which is about working with different geomantic patrons, the Archangel Gabriel, who's said to transmit geomancy, at least in Arabic and wider folklore. A particular grimoire devil, Sergat, or goes by many other names, Anabath, that teaches geomancy specifically, and working with the shade of Richard Napier. I work with as a practicing necromancer. I work with a lot of the dead magicians. I have found that magicians of any sort are often not humble or shy about giving their opinions about magic, especially other people's magic, and that doesn't seem to change when they die. And so if you're interested in not just looking at like the history of like, oh, they did this, but like potentially working out ways that you can not just call them up and ask them questions, but also seek guidance and empowerment from these tutelary shades, but who, by my experience, are still kicking around and are still very interested in talking about their livelihoods and their passions and their, their professions. Then yeah, there are a bunch of courses. If you're interested in geomancy and haven't dived in at all, I'd thoroughly recommend the Geomancy Foundation I offer, which is five classes, about 10+ hours, that will really take you from I've heard of it to like I feel confident doing charts for myself and other people. So that would be the baseline.
And where can they find that,
a bunch of
Dr. Al? Where can that be found?
I can find it on my website, imaginatively titled alexandercummins.com, and they can find it on the talks page, so .com/talks. And you can find a bunch of the classes and courses as class recordings that I offer there. And I'm also always happy to take email questions about that kind of thing as well, if folks want to reach out to me at consultantsorcerer@gmail.com, which surprisingly wasn't taken.
Consultantsorcerer@gmail.com. Okay, we have a few more questions.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Babette's asking, can you provide a broad definition of folk astrology, in quotes, folk astrology, versus other types of astrology? Why the unique title?
That's a really great question. This is something I think about a lot in terms of folk magic in general, cunningcraft, and like British traditional folk magics and things like that, as well as co-founding the folk necromancy and transmission series for Revelor Press. Like, what does it mean to be folk? I think at root it means it's done by people. It's not, and it means it's done. Right, that's the first part. Right, it isn't just an abstract thing on a shelf. Right, it's being used. That makes it folk, I think. There is a certain element that folk means kind of punk, to me at least, in the best way, of like, what do we actually need to use? What matters here, rather than like being fancy. If you have only 3 chords, like, make awesome Misfits music, right? And I think there's something to that of like, these aren't trained musicians, these aren't trained astrologers necessarily. That doesn't mean they don't practice their art and they don't develop it and they don't engage with a bunch of different things, but they're maybe less interested in esoteric completionism than they are in like what works.
I can feel Jake being here right now as you say that, though. Like, that's totally real. Wow. I can see that. Yeah,
that's the one I've kind of fallen on. I don't mean it to mean illiterate. I don't mean it to mean quaint. I don't mean it to mean like a chibi, cutesy, travel-sized kids table, like Happy Meal version of astrology. I don't mean it to mean an incomplete astrology. I mean it to mean a lived one. I think that's the easiest way I can put it. Like, illiteracy isn't an on-off switch. literacy isn't an on-off switch of like a binary of like yes or I am literate or I'm not literate. It's a case of engagement and familiarity and articulation. And so you get some incredibly, for want of a better term, learned, but not necessarily academic folk astrologers. And again, folk astrology can be super complicated. It may not involve a lot of maths and ephemerides, but it might involve like the construction of a bundle over the course of a season where you go out to the same river every day and like wash your hands in it and like say a little prayer to God at this particular tree, like that kind of stuff. Like
right.
Again,
I mean, if we're talking about literacy as reading the book of nature is different than reading text in English, right? And so we have a different level of literacy that I find actually, as someone like you who's gone through the academic pipeline and landed at the other end of a PhD, when you're doing practical work, you have to unlearn so much that gets sort of layered upon you in the hazing of becoming, the status of doctor, because that's a club that has its own practices and its own positionalities, and it isn't necessarily the sort of end all be all of how to know. And so when you say, I hear you articulate folk astrology in this way, I'm thinking of, and then along the lines of literacy, reading the book of nature is totally possible. And it doesn't mean you're not intelligent. It means you're not academic. So I thought that was a really beautiful way of putting it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the idea, right? I hope.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a few more questions before we wrap up. We're almost at time here. So was the belief in astrology total and pervasive throughout early modern society? And where can we buy the book?
Oh, great. Belief wise, right? So belief is tricky, right? How do we know what we even believe, let alone what someone else believes, let alone what someone believed 400 years ago? Like, so I'm not attacking the question exactly. I think, yes, in short, almost no one argues that like everything about astrology is nonsense. The argument is because plants do grow at a particular time of year. Like there are parts of it that are utterly empirical, right? Plants don't grow. The seed isn't going to flower at this. Isn't going to root or branch or flower or fruit at this time. It just isn't. Like there are times when you do things and there are times you don't. The moon is going to go through these phases. It's not gonna. It might look like it's going backwards at certain points, but like there's observable stuff. There's empirical things we can draw from these businesses. The idea is how much of it do they believe and what kinds of it? And we definitely see a shift in the course of the thing called the scientific revolution of like, Bacon's idea of like astrology asana, a sane astrology, right? We're not gonna chase after so many hobgoblins now, but we are going to talk about the weather. And by talking about the weather, we're going to talk about, its impact on people's decision-making process and resources, which means we're going to end up talking about politics, which means we're going to end up talking about the way people act, which means we're basically back to still various forms of predictive and politics, environmentalism.
A whole starry rubric.
Yeah.
A whole starry rubric. Very good. So to buy it, Hadean Press's website will be included also in the description of the video on the replay, but you can just Google Hadean Press Limited in the UK, and we've alerted them to this event, and they've supported and sponsored it actually at Kaylee. So thank you, Hadean, for sponsoring that. Thank you, Hadean, for trusting Al in his work at a decade ago even, and continuing to support him today. Nazarth, which is almost an anagram of my name, is your latest book with them. So I always like to transpose the letters when I read that. And you have classes coming up at Kaylee at the end of July, which we'll also be sending out on the email list. So make sure you're a part of that. And so hopefully we'll see you back in the room when Al's teaching. And yeah, if Al, you want to give a bit of a more information about what you're up to now, where people can find out what you're going to be doing now, as opposed to 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the easiest ways is either to sign up to the mailing list off the website, the Friends of English Magic, where I'm keeping track of things. I'm really excited about the classes coming up with Kaylee. We're going to talk cunning astrology, so we're literally going to get into all of that, like what were cunning folk doing with astrology and how, as well as talking about some planetary necromancy. I'm very excited to get more into what does it mean to work with the teaching dead who can help you like divine better. One of the other super exciting things that I've just started very recently, and I'm already really blown away by the support for, is a secret library of a Patreon. I spent the last couple of years pushing back on wanting to start one because so many writer friends of mine were like, it becomes a weight over your shoulders. And also I wanted to make sure that I was putting something out that was useful for people. And so I've spent the last year writing a bunch of stuff that I have been chomping at the bit to share. I'm not someone that like doesn't like, once it's done, I want instantly to talk about it. I get very excited about things, as you may have gathered by these crazy hands going off everywhere. So if you are interested in learning more about the Patreon I've started, it's patreon.com/Dr Alexander Cummins. Again, very inventive of me. And it is I'm going through in depth a bunch of the geomantic writings for an eventual, like hopefully pretty definitive reference book on not just the 16 figures of geomancy, not just how they play out in the 12 houses, but the 192 placements of those 16 figures in the houses, the like detailed write-ups of them, which I've been studying this and practicing for a while. I don't know any book that goes into that much depth. So I'm very excited to share Geomancy. I'm also doing monthly posts on cunning craft, especially like the planetary cunning and bits of astrological sorcery and spirit work and spellcraft, and a bunch of necromancy as well, talking about like black books of nigromancy, and again folding in and out of the folk necromancy that I love getting to work on with you, Jen, and with Jesse Hathaway Diaz and a number of other people. So yeah, that's the main one I'm very excited about. There's a bunch of different tiers, and if you're only interested in the cunning craft or the necromancy, you can absolutely just jump into that. But if you want to see everything, you can go and have a look at that. And I'd love for people to come and check out what I'm up to there, because it's very exciting to get to share stuff with people that are interested in progress things as well as like art and again talismanic art and ritual music that I've been mucking about with as well. So super excited to share that kind of thing.
I really love how you've carved a niche out for yourself as kind of a professor from outside the academy, but you're still professing and researching and, you know, doing your work in the world. And so let's support Al in all of that, please. So visit the Patreon, see if anything is of interest to you there. Also, you may support through coming back to Kaylee for his classes at the end of the month. And thank you for supporting him by being here today. I hope that if you didn't know about the Starry Rubric, now you do, and you can add that to your reading list. And I hope to also see you again at future events at Kaylee. So thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful Friday.
Thanks, Dr. Jen. Really appreciate being here.